find someone different in the sense that makes us uncomfortable. Christians don't like being uncomfortable, but they should. Somebody that, has a personality in a way that maybe we wouldn't hang out apart from Christ. But the fact that we are hanging out is what's going to push us to deal with our specific sins and our intolerances and our real issues that we have.
That's really good.
Now, how do parents help their kids find good friends?
One way I think is through arranged friendships. We have arranged marriages, but I'm only being slightly facetious because I think there are ways that if you see kids, you think that would be a good friend for my child. That you can try to work the circumstances so that they are coming in proximity with that person more. I mean, you could even direct their attention to, hey, well, how about so and so? Now, you obviously cannot force a friendship to form. I think if you're, I'm assuming everybody listening to this is going to be in a church, but looking within the church and looking for families with similar values in their approach to the way they live the Christian life. Because even within your church, there may be people that they're not there, and you can still befriend them. But I'm just thinking as a dad, taking off just looking at it from that narrow lens, and even maybe somewhat selfishly, but there are certain people sometimes that, yes, I want my daughter to spend more time with this person, whereas this other one, I'd be okay that, she didn't spend as much time for various reasons. And so I think you can kind of work those circumstances a little bit. But obviously you pray that God would give them good friends and teach them about friendship, how to be a good friend, and then the kinds of things to then look for in friends or try to avoid in friends.
I think parents should very, very much model this themselves as well. Parents can have far too few real friends, and I think you were getting to this, especially in men. Men. I don't know a lot of men, that are of a certain age that have a ton of male friends, and I think that's an unfortunate thing. I think that was very much a product of a specific generation, though not always. And I think parents should seek to be around it and surround their kids with their friends, the friends that push them on towards godliness. So, and further, I think. You mentioned teaching David and Jonathan as an example, but I think also even great examples of this in church history. One friendship that actually I think really encouraged me was in seeing in church history the example of Calvin and Beza. Do you know much about Calvin and Beza's friendship?
I don't.
So they were very close. Beza is kind of the successor of Calvin in Geneva, John Calvin. And they were deeply close. They were probably as close as any of the elders. But all the elders there, all the pastors there in Geneva really, truly loved one another. And I remember reading of a time where especially Beza was arguing with Calvin and upset with Calvin because Calvin was volunteering to basically offering to volunteer to help with those who were suffering of the plague. And they were going to send at least one elder to kind of permanently live with plague sufferers outside of the city and to do minister to them. And really all these elders kind of volunteered that I'll be the one, I'll be the one to do this, knowing it was a death sentence. And, and Beza saw his friend and the impact he was having in ways that would involve doing something different. And he got mad at Calvin, that Calvin kind of almost put himself in a situation where he would just do this. He was just going to do it. And I think that was a great example of real friendship where they really cared about each other and they really loved one another deeply. So
that's neat.
But I think another thing is helping their kid find good friends is you should make them want to hate their sins. You should help your son and daughter to desire to fight against their sins. And I think when they have that understanding that their sin is something to be fought against left and right, I think it will help to shape their pursuit of friends, that they'll want to have the kind of friend that can help them kill their sin rather than the kind of friend that can help them just be, nonchalant about their sin or careless with their own sins. How do parents help their kids be good friends themselves, though, Ben?
I think first you mentioned often adults don't have a lot of close friends. And I think that's true. So you want to model it yourself. And it's hard, thinking from the context that we both live in a Western society and fast-paced and just too busy. So you get caught up with the stuff that's going on with your family, and your children get a little older. And even if you don't let them just multiply activity after activity after activity, you still likely they're doing something, and trying to balance, pursuing some of these things, but also trying to be a friend at the same time, and letting them see that friendship to an extent. That person's in your home, and they're just familiar with this other person. They see how you love them, and they love you. And I think that you want to provoke your kids to see how they can then provoke love and good deeds in their friends. And that's Hebrews 10 talks about that, and that we're trying to stir up our kids to go then stir up others to do those things. And so as they're trying to do good to their friends, to do spiritual good, benefit them, they're going to be a good friend. Yeah,
that's good. So one aspect I would add to that is I think it's really important to watch how they treat others, when they're with their friends especially, and address their, they're going to have sinful behaviors. Everybody's a bad friend sometimes, and we are bad friends in different ways. And, I know actually of a situation where somebody I know had to address that their daughter was kind of in the relationship with another child, was just being the bossy, kind of the dictator, and that relationship also. And they had to really pull the person aside and address it. And maybe the other individual was not the best friend either. But the parent is responsible to deal with your kid's struggle first, rather than just, I think, do the thing where we're tempted to just kind of lambast the friends of our kids. It's really easy to blame things on the other parents rather than to have to deal with it ourselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's been situations, I think, in my oldest child, and been hurt by somebody, and part of you wants to go and I'm going to tell so-and-so a piece of my mind. They need to step in and do this, and then that's not always, generally not the most helpful thing to do.
Yeah, so. And how should parents respond when their kids pick less than great friends? Because this still does happen, doesn't it?
Yeah. I think that you want to, and I'm not speaking from, well, I guess we've had a little bit of experience in this. Now, thankfully, because my kids are young enough, they weren't hanging out with drug dealers. But I think you want to ask good questions about what draws your child to that friend. Help them to evaluate that and think about that. And is it because they enjoy sinning with the friend and like you talked about earlier, that carnal compatibility, and that's really what they're after? Or is there something else? And just getting them to reflect on that. There's also a time when you do limit I talked about the arranged friendships. There's a time when you do intentionally limit the contact depending on the nature of the situation. And maybe in some context you even try to get to know that friend at some level. And so while you can show a level of love for your child by showing love to their friend while also not being fully affirming, I want you to spend a lot of time with this person.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Those are some really helpful thoughts. So first off, I want to say we should not condemn evangelism, because actually I do know of a case where I know of a teen that has friendships with people that are not the world's best influences, that do sins that are frowned upon more than other sins, and this teen legitimately is trying to be an evangelist and trying to share the gospel to these friends of this teen. And this teen is actually heartbroken over the reality of their sin. So I think that is a deeply important thing, is don't condemn evangelism. and be careful that with legalism in that same vein. So this hits close to home because I remember I found out that there were some people in my youth group when I was a teenager where the parents kind of told them not to hang around and where they didn't go to youth group much because I was going there. And the reason why was I did not come up in that same religious background that, let's say, you did. And when I came to youth group, I swore like crazy prior to that. And I think I tried to be mindful of it, but it was my language, it was something I didn't even think about at times. And so, when I really wanted to grow in Christ but was messing up some people were kind of pushing their kids away from me. And and it's personal, of course, but I think in general that's unhelpful for us. I think we shouldn't raise legalism over dealing with sin issues. So, and I think also deal with the hard issues of why they value those relationships over others. Because ultimately, the friendship is not the main issue when our kids have bad friends. The deeper issue is that there is a heart desire that wants to grab hold of those relationships over other relationships, and there's a reason why. And I think we need to help our kids process that. So, and at times we should lovingly be strict. That means you deal with kids in a ministry more than I do now, and you can have times where parent doesn't drop the kids off with the kid that's not a great influence on them. But with teens sometimes it's a little harder, but I think a parent should still be willing to love their kid enough to strictly tell them, I don't want you hanging out around with that person anymore, and tell them that in love and compassion and understanding.
Yeah, that's good insight.
So, how can next generation ministries equip young people to look for the right kind of friends?
I think some through just direct teaching on that. Have a series on friendship or something of that nature. I think in your application too, raising questions or trying to get to the heart of matters about how to be a friend. And just thinking through, especially if you're in a role of teaching regularly like that, just making it a grid that you kind of run things through. Because adults even are not always great, often not great at being friends. Sin just has corrupted our capacities. And so kids, how much less so. I was talking to Hannah, my intern, before this and just asking her feedback on some of these questions and thinking through it because they're really good questions. And, we were talking about how kids, in some ways it's easier for them because especially the little ones, they're just like, hey, do you want to be my friend? Okay, let's go play on the swings. And then they don't even know the person's name. It's like, oh yeah, that's my best friend. And they just enjoy being together and it's just simpler. Things get more complex as you're an adult, but the kids are still learning what happens when conflict arises in the relationship. And so, and I think that applies to children's ministry as well as the youth ministry, just making that a good part of what you run things through. You've probably heard Mark Dever talk about this, but he's got a preaching application grid, and
yes.
he takes his points and lines it up. And actually, that's something I've implemented and found that helpful because it's getting me to think about different kinds of people and how they may need to hear that particular point. And so something like that may be useful. I think too, you can encourage different contexts for it. I'm hesitant to build the ministry, just all of events, but I think there can be a place for that where you're encouraging the building of godly friendships and you're engaging in those to some extent, and maybe there's have you met so and so, and you're trying to do a little bit of setting people up in that sense, but I think those are some of the ways. How about what are your thoughts on that?
Those are some really helpful thoughts. I want to add two quick things. One is more rooted in kids, and one is dealing really more specifically with youth. One, I think you mentioned teaching on it. And specifically, take times to teach Proverbs. I think Proverbs, we talked about long gospel in the last podcast, and Proverbs sometimes can be avoided because we see it as kind